So welcome everyone to the first seminar in our online lecture series on resource struggles and international law under occupation, convened by myself, Julia Dem, and my colleagues Sahiba Muckwell and Caitlin Murphy. Before introducing our speaker, we want to acknowledge that we're joining the seminar from occupied land, and that struggles for land justice, for water justice, and resource justice continue across this continent. I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations as the traditional owners of the land on which I'm standing, and that their land was stolen and their sovereignty never ceded. I pay my respects to their elders past and present.
This lecture series seeks to foster interdisciplinary and historically inflected discussions about how international law both shapes and is shaped by struggles over natural resources. In semester two, which we're starting today, we're really focusing on resource struggles in the context of occupation around the world. We're collectively exploring how struggles over resource plunder and exploitation shape the dynamics of occupation and how peoples under occupation are contesting extraction and asserting ownership and sovereignty over resources as part of broader resistance movements. We're really lucky to have speakers examining struggles under occupation in Greenland, West Papua, Palestine, Kashmir, Bougainville, and Western Sahara to consider the different forms of political contestation that they produce and how resource struggles might be mobilized to enliven political possibilities for self-determination and decolonisation.
And we're delighted to have such a wonderful lineup of speakers for our first semester, as well as Professor Christine Patel, who we'll hear from today. We'll have lectures from Dr. Sophie Chow on West Papua, Professor Michael Link on Palestine, Dr. Omar Ajiri on Kashmir, Professor Kristen Laslett on Bougainville, Dr. Randy Irwin on Western Sahara, and Dr. Handil Abu Hussein on Palestine. And details of those other lectures we'll put in the chat, so please do register for them if you have not yet. Additionally, Dr. Anna Saunders and I are convening a reading group on the theme of making and unmaking natural resources, and I'll also put some information about that in the chat.
So we're delighted to introduce our speaker for today. Christine Schwöbel Patel is a professor in the School of Law at the University of Warwick. In her research and teaching, Professor Schwöbel Patel adopts a critical position on contemporary issues of public international law, whether global constitutionalism, international criminal law, or climate justice. Her current project aims to uncover the role of law in extractivism and the creation of new energy sacrifice zones in the green transition. Christine's critique is informed by a political economy, post-colonial, feminist, and aesthetics lenses. With this, she reveals the international legal power dynamics and their entanglement with material conditions that influence biases of race, class, and gender. Professor Schwöbel Patel has published very widely. We've got some details in the poster that you can see her publications, but really relevant to the talk today is her forthcoming book, Green Frontiers, The Laws of Extraction in the Green Transition, which is under contract with Verso. And so we're delighted to have you here, Christine, and over to you.
Thank you so much for the invitation for having me as part of this series. It's a huge honor. I hugely admire, I already said it beforehand, but I'll say it with the other participants present as well. I hugely admire the work Julia and Caitlin are doing and think that this kind of series is academically important, politically important, and for creating communities really important. So I'm going to be talking about the natural resources I'm going to be talking about are those that are relevant to the green transition. And there is 3 sites that I will be discussing. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint. It worked earlier, so fingers crossed. Right, can you see my, yes, okay, excellent. Right, so the 3 sites that I'm talking about today and I've been researching on are Greenland, Gaza, and the DRC. And these 3 sites are frontiers in what I call the laws of extraction. So I wanted to begin by talking about, the role of international law in this, and we've heard a lot about the death of international law recently, this is the image from a Guardian piece on "Are we witnessing the death of international law?" And of course, considering the genocide in Palestine, and the ineffectiveness of international law in terms of climate justice and various other crises that we have in the world, we could conclude that we are witnessing the death of international law. However, I think what we need to turn attention to, what I've been trying to turn attention to, is the ways in which international law continues to work very well. So, where is it that international law is strong? Now, it's not necessarily easy to identify these areas, and that's why I'm trying to bring them together in the laws of extraction. It can seem like a real scramble of different laws, public laws, private laws that come together. And really, the first task is to try and map what these laws are that are working extremely well and are extremely powerful. And to make sense of that, I've chosen these three sites that I spoke about: Greenland, Gaza, and the DRC, because I see them as three important frontiers of expansionism and expansion of extractivism. They also, I identify these as three different phases in extractivism. So I call these the exploration frontier, the extraction colony frontier, and then the sacrifice zone frontier, and exemplify these different frontiers through the images that you see here of Greenland. I'm sure you've all heard of Trump's desire to get Greenland one way or another. Those were his words. And then the second image that you can see here, that's an AI generated image of a vision for reconstruction of Gaza that came out of Netanyahu's office, that I will be focusing on, or that's going to be sort of the main focus of what I'll be talking about in terms of the extraction colony frontier. And then the last image that you see there is of the DRC as exemplifying the sacrifice zone frontier. So frontiers, there's the associations created through sort of a dominant Western narrative of frontiers are that they are spaces of adventure. Here you see sort of the typical Wild West imagery around frontiers. And an image, of course, that is recurring in that is this idea of the angel of progress. You might, this image might be familiar to you from, because it's also the book cover of Dina Tsavala's fantastic book on capitalism as civilization. Very recently, as you can see here in July, the Homeland Security of the US posted this on Twitter, on X, saying a heritage to be proud of, a homeland worth defending. What is problematic, of course, with this image and the imagery around frontierism is that, of course, the frontier is also a space of domination and occupation, and often also genocide. So we see in this particular image here the forward march of what is seen as progress, but which is also the elimination of the indigenous peoples. And something that I think is just worth noting about that image, because it's something that I'll come back to, is that this the angel of progress is holding here a telegraph wire. So the forward movement with this telegraph wire is something that I'll come back to, because I think it's very key to think about these infrastructures when we talk about frontiers. Now, as you can imagine, billionaires, particularly American billionaires, are obsessed with this idea of the frontier. Many of them have set up corporate entities that have frontier in them. They set up various business meetings and so on for that sort of blue sky thinking of frontiers. So it's a really dominant idea. And I think that it is worth considering how international law what international law does to facilitate this forward movement of capital through the laws of extraction and in how it actually works as frontier law. And for this, it's worth going back also in history and thinking about the what international law has previously done to facilitate that forward movement of capital in order to create these frontiers of extraction. And this takes us back to Leopold II of Belgium and his colonization of the large parts of the Congo, and the role that law played in that colonization. So there are two distinct sort of legal movements that were happening at that time. There was one in which Leopold II sent out individuals to have treaties signed with chiefs that were about trade and about resources and about the privileges of the Belgians coming into the Congo. Later on, these individual treaties, hundreds of these, were signed with chiefs in the Congo. These treaties played a really important role for then the International Law Treaty, the General Act of Berlin of 1885, which is also now associated with the Scramble for Africa, to seal the legitimacy of Leopold II and the extraction, the territorialization that occurred in the Congo. And what's really significant about the General Act of Berlin is that this was the stabilization of the legitimacy of extractivism vis-a-vis the other competing imperial powers. So as you will likely know, at the Berlin Conference, there were no Africans present, and none of these chiefs also who had signed these treaties. It was only the other imperial powers. So we learn from that international law has always played an interesting and significant and troubling role in legitimizing this forward thrust of capital. And the forward thrust of capital is a terminology that I take from Rosa Luxemburg, who is my leading lady in terms of how I theorized the extractivism and new frontiers. Rosa Luxemburg was a revolutionary who lived in Polish-German revolutionary who lived at the beginning, who was politically active at the beginning of the 20th century in Berlin in the workers' movement. And she was an extraordinary political economist who wrote about primitive accumulation, which in sort of Marxist terminology is the expansion of capital. And Rosa Luxemburg built on Marx, but really thought about the expansion of capital into and outside of the capitalist center, which at that time was Europe. So she really thought about how colonialism and capitalist expansion work together. And what she said about this expansion was that it's spatial, so it's not only about labor relations, but it's also crucially about the land and the resources on the land. It's racial in terms of the hierarchization that's really crucial there for the expansion of capital, and it's legal. So what's really important really interesting going back to Luxemburg's work is that she looked at the what we as international lawyers now teach as unequal treaties. So she looked at how those worked in terms of legitimizing these forward thrusts of capital. And what I've done is to look at Rosa Luxemburg's work on primitive accumulation and kind of to read at it together with her work on ecology, because I think this really helps us understand an ecological or it gives us a really great foundation for an ecological understanding of primitive accumulation. Because Rosa Luxemburg also created herbaria. So herbaria are collections of plant specimens, and she just went into her local area and collected plants and created these sort of catalogues of plants. She labeled them, their species and so on. She knew a lot about this because she studied first zoology and ecology and geology at university. So this is where her interest really started, and then only did she move on to studying political economy and law. And what I've done is I've tried to read the ecology that was at the forefront of her mind in her working and also in her political work into her work on primitive accumulation. And this helps us understand what Rosa Luxemburg does is she talks about these different phases in the forward thrusts of capital. And I've slightly adjusted her wording for these phases, but she also talks about 3 different phases as I do in the frontier. So I'm very much indebted to her in trying to make sense of what happens in the forward thrust of capital and putting that into conversation with international law. The first phase is the exploration frontier. Now, Rosa Luxemburg is often critiqued because it said, well, she was thinking about the forward thrust of capital at a time when there really were spaces which were not already saturated with capital and capitalism. So she was thinking about those times of colonialism where the capitalist core would encounter, like in the DRC in Leopold II's time, would encounter spaces of indigenous peoples and subsistence lifestyles. Now, what's interesting about Greenland is that it, on the one hand, is already a colonized space. Greenland is not a independent state, but is very much tied to its former colonial master, Denmark. But in Greenland, there are indigenous peoples who still lead a subsistence lifestyle. So the exploration frontier in that inside-outside dynamic that was interesting to Rosa Luxemburg still exists. And what happens there in legal terms, the intervention that international law makes, is this territorialization. And historically, as international lawyers, we would call that the this is just these slides, just a quick footnote on these slides is just to say, of course, we're familiar with Trump's interest in Greenland, But this is also an inter-imperial rivalry. Various billionaires are investing in Greenland. Denmark is trying to hold on to its power and is very much an imperial actor within this. China and Russia are also have also sort of set their sights on Greenland. The EU has opened an office there. There is a real scrambling, as there was a scramble for Africa. There's a real scrambling for resources and minerals in Greenland. I don't think I mentioned that this is the downside of not having a script. The the interest in Greenland is because due to climate change, the ice is melting, which is revealing critical what are designated as critical raw minerals, which are seen as key for the green transition. Okay, I need to speed up a little bit so that we can definitely get to Gaza and the extraction colony. So just to say, the exploration frontier is about securing land and the transformation of land into territory. International law here can facilitate that through various mechanisms, including recognizing the right to self-determination, as has been the case with Greenland, but with strings attached, and very important strings attached that continue to enable extraction and crucially the commodification of nature. So the transformation of nature into natural resources is one of the key transformations that's facilitated through international law at this frontier. So I did want to move on to the extraction colony and this really quite disgusting imagery of a well, post-genocidal future really for Gaza. So the Gaza 2035 plans came out of Netanyahu's office already last year, and have not, I believe they haven't been given the attention that they deserve, because I think there are some things that are really quite alarming about it, and that's not just the terrible aesthetic of these AI images. One of the really key elements, and these images actually were very recently when the Washington Post leaked these plans, and it's really if these documents are freely available on the internet, if you look at them, they look like a pitch deck, a business pitch deck for Gaza, and one of the so there's been a lot of attention put on the idea of the Riviera of the Middle East, with hotels and seaside resorts and things like that. Now, I think what's more interesting and more alarming is that there is a whole plan for an integration of northern Gaza as an electric vehicle industrial zone. And there's an integration with Gaza into a economic zone that facilitates the a value chain of the minerals which are said to be shipped from Saudi Arabia and the UAE. We'll see with the latest tensions with Saudi Arabia whether that is realistic, but that is the idea. The minerals would be then brought to Gaza, where there would be these manufacturing sites. Now, why I think that is alarming is because that is within the same patterns that we already saw from Leopold II and what he did in the Congo, where he said the Berlin Act is about ending the slave trade. It's not about extractivism. It's not about exploitation of labor. It's about ending the slave trade. And what I think we see here is a greenwashing of the genocide. And it's the typical sort of features of frontierism seen as an opportunity for investment and for wealth for some, while eliminating, of course, the indigenous peoples, or really sucking any remaining labor force as and it says somewhere on the pitch deck as well, any Palestinians would be the cheap labor that would be working within these industrial zones. So international law facilitates this in very particular ways through enabling these special economic zones. Special economic zones are incredibly common, and they can be free trade zones. So there are no barriers to capital flow. Then this is where infrastructure projects really become important, also enabled through international trade laws, communications, railways, and so on. And we can see in those AI images how key infrastructure is to enabling these post-genocidal visions of Gaza. And then domestic criminal laws and also international criminal law can then step in if to criminalize these barriers to capital flow. Investment arbitration is a key tool here for protecting foreign investments. And then also international law facilitates the indebtedness, so securing dependence of the extraction colony to the capitalist center. This is a quote from Marx just about the again how key infrastructure is of overcoming any spatial barriers that there might be for smooth capital flow. So for the exploration frontier, I sort of categorized the transformations that happen through international law as frontier law, under territorialization and under commodification. In the extraction colony, this is really about integration. So the integration of the already colonized, already territorialized space into these global capitalist dynamics. And it's about externalization. So the measures that are put in place, in particular through investment laws and international corporate laws, to protect foreign capital and to diminish any importance or relevance of local justice systems or local laws. And the third element, the third transformation that is enabled through international law as frontier law, is dependence. And that's often enabled through debt, as I've already mentioned, through restructuring programs, and a continuing limiting of the right to self-determination. Then in the last few minutes, I also wanted to mention the third frontier, which is the sacrifice zone frontier. Although I have exemplified these different frontiers through different sites, of course, the point is to show that from the exploration frontier emerges the extraction colony, and from that emerges the sacrifice zone. So those are the transitions that I think we should be paying attention to, in particular in regards to or putting that into conversation with the dominant ideas of the green transition. So I think that the really what we can see here are transitions in frontierism. The sacrifice zone, then, as exemplified through the DRC, is really when I've used here a quote from Rosa Luxemburg. The triumph of imperialism means the collapse of all civilization, as in ancient Rome, depopulation, desolation, degeneration, a great cemetery. So the features of the sacrifice zone frontier are that exploitation of human and non-human nature has gone to such an extent that the only thing that wins is capital. So this is where we then see an intensification of laws, and yet the creation of a seemingly lawless place. And this is often facilitated through corporate laws. So this is where we then see corporates taking a step back and saying, "Oh, this is all about mining companies," which I've been studying in terms of what they do with minerals, in particular rare minerals. They like to say in those spaces, they like to say this is all about the subsidiaries, and they really sort of distance themselves from what's happening on the ground, while at the same time using CSR and so on to create those sort of publicity distances between what's happening on the ground. And then the three transformations that occur here through the intervention of international law is fragmentation, exemption, and then finally intervention. So very common feature of this frontier is that military or private security intervention will at some point happen in the service of capital, often also with a strong narrative of civilization. Because when capital has destroyed human and non-human nature in such an intense way, there's often a regurgitation, I was going to say, but maybe that's the right word, of the civilization narrative, which then is about the making and remaking of frontiers, really, because the frontier is this constant shift between what is seen as ordered and civilized and legal, and the space that is unordered and uncivilized and illegal. So that's just another image here of the Berlin conference. I think so much of what I've been looking at really goes back to these kinds of patterns that were set in the 19th century. And then maybe we'll have a chance to also talk about that in the Q&A. But I've become increasingly convinced that the key efforts that should be put into understanding the laws of extraction is to undo some of these laws. So to really think about abolitionism in the sense of how can we abolish investment law, and some of the institutions that support these forward thrusts of capital. I've been looking at abolitionist literature there that distinguishes itself from the kind of scorching of the earth narrative that we see from Trump and Netanyahu, this sort of clean sheets thinking, but really works with what is already there. So abolition as working with the existing fragments and pieces, experiments and possibilities. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you so much. And I'm really curious to hear what you guys think about that, because I've just given you a full summary of the entire book. So very, very curious to hear your thoughts and whether that's helpful for making sense of extraction under occupation. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Feel very privileged to have a little sneak preview of the book. And obviously we are eagerly awaiting it actually coming out shortly. I guess I sort of had a methodological question coming out of this, because in some way the premise of the lecture series is that it's really important to sort of look at different contexts of occupation in a comparative lens. And there's a lot that we can learn from, understanding the different techniques and violences that are used in terms of resource extraction in different contexts and the different struggles and resistance movements in different contexts as well. But I think what your talk and the book really does is, rather than the comparative analysis, even though there's a bit of that as well, is really showing the ways in which these different sites are connected by being situated along the same global value chains or being linked through the same infrastructures, whether that's through legal infrastructures, but also physical infrastructures, ports, railways, airports, the things that allow for the movement and the circulation of capital. And I was just wondering if you want to sort of speak to, what it is that sort of methodological move of connecting these different sites really allows us to see and illuminate that we don't do if we sort of just look at each of these in isolation.
Thank
And
you so
just so
much,
sorry,
Julie.
please, everyone raise your hand or put a question in the chat if you have any questions for Christine.
Would you like me to respond straight away while people think of some questions that they might have? Yeah. Okay. That's a very, very generous question, because it allows me to emphasize two things that I think are really important. So you're quite right. This is about tracing continuations. And one of the really key continuations that I wanted to highlight is that frontierism, I'm looking at frontierism in regard to the green transition, but this is the continuation of the laws of extraction that we already have seen through other natural resources, in particular fossil capital, of course. So this whole narrative of the green transition is taking us away from that. So long as we have the conditions of capitalism, they will be continued, and we will continue to see, rather depressingly, we will continue to see those same patterns. And then also what I think is so important in terms of creating connections between different spaces is because, so I don't pretend to have established yet really solid relationships with the indigenous populations of Greenland, but I do have contacts in Greenland, and including some groups and some people who are thinking very carefully about what mineral mining could mean for Greenland. And what I have found really interesting in speaking to them is that they are not necessarily aware that there are similar struggles, and there is also there are similar resistance struggles happening in other places, in Canada and Australia and so on, and other settler colonial spaces of extractivism, where there is a where these resistance struggles can learn from each other, and that's why I think also creating these connections is so key.
Thanks. Aman, did you want to ask your question? I think Caitlin then also has a question, so we'll take both. Aman, over to you.
Hi, am I audible? Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Christine. This was fantastic. Really excited to see the book coming. I just had a question actually, and it's more of an invitation for you to speak to something, and I was finding it very fascinating. I find it very compelling that you started your account by speaking to this question of death of international law versus the fact that it's pretty much living and it's living pretty well in certain spaces. So I was thinking of living or the life of international law as a site here. And I was wondering that there are various forms of living of international law. So I was just thinking of the various stages that you walked us through, or these various phases that you walked us through. And I was wondering of the kind of forms of life there is. Are we looking at international law's old arsenal, which is useful in sustaining? Or is there a vibrant form of international law or law making and creation that you're also seeing in these spaces? So the reason I ask is that, I mean, I'm sort of also thinking that imperialism, if one were to see it in terms of phases, whether it's necessarily sustains on creative legal thinking these days, or is it kind of taking back to like old forms and living a life of sustenance as opposed to like a vibrant forms of creation? Yeah.
Thank you, Aman. I love that question. And yeah, because so I was trying to, I mean, as you might have noticed, I like to categorize these things to try and make sense of them. And um, when I was looking at all this literature about the death and the morbidity of international law, I sort of thought it's this idea of international law as Gothic, right? There's this real kind of Gothic terminology around it, the demise of international law and so on, and you're right. It is really about looking at where the vitality, the continued vitality of it. While you were asking your question, I was thinking of something that my friend Nehed Samua, also a fantastic international lawyer, she said recently. And she said that this is about the what's happening in Palestine is about the demise of liberal international law. And she said the problem is that we are still searching within liberal international law for anti-colonial problems, right? So we're looking for solutions in liberal international law for anti-colonial problems. She said it much better than I did that. And I think that there's so much truth in that in terms of thinking about vitality, and also if we think about that our role as international lawyers might be of breathing life into an anti-colonial international law and accepting the demise of liberal international law.
Thanks. Made me sort of wonder if it's useful to talk about sort of zombie international law that seems, keeps going, but has lost any sort of its
Absolutely.
promise or anything that it ever had. And well, I think we're seeing really at the moment that it's, people like the flotilla in particular who are the only people really acting and enforcing international law at the moment. Caitlin, you had a question as well?
Sure. So thanks, Christine. That was really powerful and useful. I was just interested in your thoughts on the kind of contemporary commentary around the green transition, that there's a kind of different state corporate relationship or collaboration maybe emerging, or a different kind of way that those two bodies of extraction are happening. Is there a particular way that you see the kind of state billionaire or state corporation relationship in these contexts.
Yeah, again, I would kind of say what's more fascinating to me are the continuations, and this is why I've become so obsessed with Leopold II, right? Leopold II essentially took the Congo as a personal private enterprise, right? And it was only when public opinion against him had shifted so much that this became a real scandal at the time because people started understanding what was happening in the Congo. Now, this was not, of course, live streamed in the same way that the genocide has been for us, but there were increasing accounts from missionaries who came back from the Congo, and then, of course, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, so literary explanations and so on. And there was such a backlash against the private entity that then the Belgian government begrudgingly, they really weren't interested in having a colony in the first place, but begrudgingly then agreed to making it a formal colony, right? So it became a public entity. So I think that what's so interesting is that these dynamics of sort of shifting from the public private depending on what is useful for expansion of capital, that has always been there. And of course, we know that from the various the East India companies and so on. But again, sort of what we see in the Congo of the move from private to public is really instructive, I think. Yeah.
I'll just jump in again because I've just got a lot of questions, but I do hope someone else raises their hand so we don't hear much more of my voice talking. But one of the things I was really struck in that horrifying pitch that you were showing us too was the invocation of the Gaza Marine area as providing the gas for these places, given just how controversial all the questions around gas extraction from the Gaza Marine area is. The state of Palestine has, in the law of the sea, declared it in, their territory. Yet you're seeing while the genocide's going on, Israel, giving exploration licenses to part of that area. And so, again, I think we're going to hear more about that in Michael's lecture in a couple of weeks, hopefully. But it just sort of really struck me how compounding these violations are, and just whether you want to speak to that as well.
Yeah, so just for some background info, yeah, Gaza Marine is a an offshore gas resource that was being discovered, has not really been has not gas has not really been exploited from there yet in any kind of commercial sense, but it's always been seen as some kind of potential, both by the Palestinians as a potential source of energy that is off the coast of Gaza, and so, part of Palestinian territory, but also, of course, by the Israelis. And it gave rise to a real question of kind of ethical academic publishing some months back, because a piece was published in the Leiden Journal of International Law that thought about energy extraction by Israelis in terms of scenario thinking. What happens after the war, and where will energy come from? And one of the scenarios, which is, again, really, I can only think of the word disgusting, was that, well, once Gaza has been annexed, and and then that access to the sea is no longer possible, Palestine would be a landlocked country, which would mean that Israel then would have access to the energy sources that are offshore. Um, so that quite rightly led to an uproar in the academic community about, is this kind of scenario thinking even, is it ethical to allow the publication of this kind of thing? So that's a little bit on the background of Gaza Marine, but it's also, I think, important for and I'm not, by no means the first person to say this continuation from fossil capital to green colonialism, because we see there's a fantastic book that came out recently by Jean-Baptiste Baptiste Feroz, called More and More and More, which shows that what we think of energy transitions were just accumulations, not just, this is the whole point. They were energy accumulations. So there was no transition in the sense from coal to oil, because there was an accumulation. And it's the same when we think of the green transition. It's impossible to think of the green transition without also fossil fuels under this capitalist model. And we see that in really exemplified in these ideas for Gaza. The Gaza Marine, the gas, would provide energy for the electric vehicle manufacturing that is intended to be a response to a climate catastrophe. So we see there this really demonstrated really well, I think, and in a very troubling way.
Thanks so much. Sophie.
Thanks, Julia. And thank you, Christine, for the fascinating talk. I was just wondering if you could perhaps tell us a little bit more about Rosa Luxemburg's work on her, or how her work on the herbariums went on to influence how she theorized the forward thrust of capital. And I ask this partly because in my own work, I'm fascinated by the influence of ecological metaphors, or the transfer of ecological metaphors into a whole lot of range of ways of thinking about climate change response and systems thinking. But what we observe, what we see usually in the use of these kinds of metaphors is a naturalization of politics, a kind of what amounts to a kind of a justification of the way that things are or should be because they're perceived as natural. But that doesn't seem to be at all what would have been going on in what Rosa Luxemburg was trying to do. So I'd just be really interested to hear you talk about that some more.
Yay, a Rosicrucian. Thank you. I always have to stop myself because I could speak about Rosa Luxemburg all day. But yeah, thank you so much for asking that. So what I have found so interesting in the literature, so her herbarium was found not too long ago. I can't remember the exact date, in the early 2000s, I think. And then it's been published since in a really beautiful book. I was going to see whether I can show it to you, but it's a really beautiful book. And all the commentary of it, as previously also, she was a very accomplished artist. And in her letters, she writes a lot about the nature that she sees, and that she interacts with, also the plants, what she knows about the plants around her, and so on. And there's a real way in which that was kind of romanticized as like, that is like the feminine, softer part of Rosa Luxemburg, while then her political economy questions, that's like the masculinized, that's when she argued with Lenin and so on. That's the force behind her, that's the power in her. And I sort of read her letters, in terms of she led a revolutionary life. She didn't have sort of holidays from revolution where she went on walks and collected plants. No, and in her letters, you can really see how her thoughts about ecology are so tied in to her thoughts of political economy as well. And there has been sort of a real kind of gendering, I think, of that part of her life that I'm trying to undo, because just as in her letters we see, you know, her letters were to her various lovers who were also revolutionaries, right? So this is part of her revolutionary life very much. And what I think has happened in terms of metaphors is that Rosa Luxemburg's writing on land, natural resources, and plants in primitive accumulation has often been seen more as metaphor than in how I think we should read it is in political ecology in a material sense. She was writing about land and natural resources because she was interested in the extraction that occurred then, the depletion of nature and so on. So she couldn't foresee climate catastrophe in the way she did, of course she couldn't, but she knew what the processes of capital accumulation had to do with ecology, and that's why I think her work is so instructive. There's been a lot of sort of eco-Marxism that's come up in the past years of where Marx has been reread in those ways, and various other sort of male Marxists. But with Rosa, she knew her shit on this. She knew about geology, she knew about ecology. She had studied these and continued to study them. So often her herbarium is seen as like she did then this revolutionary stuff, and then when she was like middle-aged in her mid-40s, shortly before she was killed, she turned to plants and for comfort. And there's a lot about her, how they were sort of her mental health crutches and things like that. No, fuck no. Like this was part of her revolutionary life, and it was an integral part of her political economy thinking. Sorry, there was a lot of swearing in that.
I think that's a really wonderful
Excited.
place to end. About the need for that sort of political ecology analysis then and now. So please join me, everyone, in thanking Christine for a wonderful lecture, and thank you all for coming along. Please do register to attend the future lectures in the series. I'm very much looking forward to Sophie Chow speaking about West Papua next week, is it? Yeah. So I hope to see many of you there again too. Thanks.